The morning sun was shining bright over the academy grounds, and the air was filled with excitement and pride. Families walked together across the wide campus, some holding flowers, others carrying cameras to capture this once-in-a-lifetime moment. Among them walked Sergeant Marcus Hill, a tall man with strong shoulders, wearing his Marine uniform. His steps were steady, and his back was straight, the way years of military service had trained him. His eyes, however, were softer that day, filled with joy and love for one reason: his only son David was graduating from the military academy. Marcus had been through battles most people only read about in newspapers. He had spent nights in deserts, days in jungles, and weeks on ships far away from home. But nothing in his long career brought him as much pride as this day. His son had followed in his footsteps, not because Marcus forced him, but because David had admired the courage and discipline he saw in his father since childhood. Today, David was not only graduating, he was graduating at the top of his class. That thought alone made Marcus's chest feel warm with pride. As he reached the hall, Marcus noticed the large banners hung across the walls with the academy's motto. The building was grand, with polished floors that shined like glass and rows of flags lined up high. Families filled the seats, their voices echoing in cheerful chatter. Laughter mixed with the sound of children running between the rows. Marcus stood quietly for a moment, taking in the scene. He adjusted his cap and walked toward the VIP section, where his son had arranged for him to sit. The seats were reserved for parents of graduates who had achieved special recognition. When Marcus reached the row, some people looked up at him. A few smiled politely, but others gave him long, questioning stares. He could feel the weight of their eyes, but he ignored it. After all, he had spent his whole life in uniforms, and he knew how to carry himself in silence. He sat down, smoothing the crease of his jacket. He took out the small invitation card his son had mailed to him weeks earlier and placed it gently on his lap as if it were a medal. For Marcus, this was more than just a ceremony. It was proof of everything he had worked hard for: not money, not fame, but the future of his family. David had grown up without his father around for long periods. Marcus had missed birthdays and holidays, often writing letters from faraway places instead of being there in person. He always worried that those absences would leave a gap between him and his son. But David had never blamed him. Instead, he used his father's sacrifice as motivation. And now, here they were, father and son united on the day of triumph. As the crowd settled, Marcus glanced around the room. He saw families hugging, proud mothers wiping away tears, and fathers shaking hands with their sons. He thought of his own late wife, who had passed away when David was still in high school. She would have been so proud to see this moment. Marcus whispered softly under his breath, "We did it, Linda. He made it." His eyes grew a little misty, but he quickly blinked away the tears. Marines did not cry easily, but fathers did. The ceremony had not yet begun, so Marcus allowed himself to relax in his seat. He could hear the band warming up outside, the sound of drums and trumpets filling the air. Students in crisp uniforms lined up at the back of the hall, ready to march in. Everything about the scene was perfect. Yet Marcus felt a slight uneasiness. He noticed two security guards standing a few feet away, looking in his direction. At first, he thought nothing of it: guards were always present at such events. But their eyes lingered too long on him, whispering to each other, nodding his way. Marcus straightened in his seat and held his invitation card in his hand. He knew who he was and what he had earned, but something told him the day might not go as smoothly as he hoped. Still, he decided not to let worry cloud his joy. He focused instead on the stage where, in a few minutes, his son would walk proudly and receive his honors. As more families entered, the hall filled with louder conversations and the rustle of chairs. Marcus sat silently, his heart steady but full. He thought about the long nights he had spent writing to his son, encouraging him, telling him never to give up, reminding him that discipline was the bridge between goals and success. David had listened, and now he was proof that lessons of perseverance never go to waste. The announcer's voice finally echoed through the hall, asking everyone to take their seats. Marcus leaned back, holding his cap in his lap, and closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Pride and anticipation washed over him. He could already imagine the look on his son's face when their eyes met across the hall. It would be the look of a son telling his father, "I did it because of you." The band struck up a strong note, and the doors at the back opened. Cadets began to march in, their boots striking the floor in perfect rhythm. The audience clapped and cheered, and Marcus rose to his feet with everyone else, clapping harder than most, his heart swelling. Somewhere in that line was his boy, the little child he had once carried on his shoulders, now grown into a man wearing the same kind of uniform. For Marcus, this was the greatest reward life could give him. He had fought for his country, and now his son was prepared to do the same. He thought to himself, "No matter what anyone thinks of me, nothing can take away this moment." But deep inside, he still felt the strange attention of those two guards, who had been watching him since he arrived. He brushed off the thought, refusing to let it ruin what should be the proudest day of his life. For now, all that mattered was his son's graduation, the shining moment he had waited for all these years. The cheers in the hall were still ringing when Marcus slowly sat back down in his seat. His hands rested on his knees, and he felt his heartbeat quicken with excitement. He could see the cadets now standing tall at the front, ready for the ceremony to officially begin. Parents all around him were smiling and whispering proudly to one another. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the stage, waiting for the moment he had dreamed about for years. Just then, the sound of footsteps broke his concentration. Two security guards, both in pressed uniforms with badges pinned to their chests, began walking toward him. At first, Marcus thought they might be checking tickets or perhaps confirming that the right families were in the right seats. He held his invitation card ready, knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But as the guards approached, their faces carried something other than routine professionalism. Their brows were furrowed, their eyes sharp, and their voices low as they spoke to each other. One of them, a tall man with a serious look, leaned down slightly and said, "Sir, can we see your seating pass?" Marcus nodded calmly. "Of course," he replied, handing them the invitation card his son had sent him. The guard studied it for a moment, then looked back at Marcus with a doubtful expression. "This section is reserved," the guard said firmly. "Are you sure you belong here?" Marcus felt the sting of the words but kept his composure. "Yes," he said steadily. "My son is David Hill. He is graduating today at the top of his class. He personally arranged for me to sit here." He pointed at the card, which had the Academy's official seal. The second guard, shorter but more aggressive in tone, crossed his arms. "This doesn't look right. We're going to need you to step outside while we confirm." Marcus straightened his back even more, his jaw tightening. He had faced far tougher situations in war zones, but this was different. This was not a battlefield, this was his son's proudest day. And now, in front of dozens of families, he was being questioned as though he were a trespasser. Around him, people began to notice. Some leaned in to watch, others whispered behind their hands. A few mothers looked away uncomfortably, not wanting to get involved, while others stared openly with curiosity. The warm atmosphere of celebration slowly shifted into uneasy silence around Marcus's row. "I assure you," Marcus said in a calm but firm voice, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be. This is my son's graduation, and I have every right to be here." He placed the card back into the guard's hand. But the guards were unmoved. The taller one repeated, "Sir, we need you to come with us." Marcus's chest tightened. He thought of David waiting backstage, completely unaware of what was happening. The last thing he wanted was for his son to walk onto the stage and not see him in the audience. That thought cut deeper than anything the guards could say. Still, he refused to cause a scene. He had been trained all his life to maintain discipline under pressure, and he was not about to lose it here. With a steady voice, Marcus said, "This uniform I wear has earned me the right to be treated with respect. I will not be leaving my son's graduation." The shorter guard frowned. "Sir, don't make this difficult. If you don't step outside, we'll have to escort you." Gasps could be heard from some of the nearby families. A father sitting 2 rows back shook his head, whispering to his wife, "That man's in uniform. Why are they treating him like this?" A few others murmured agreement, but most stayed silent, afraid of drawing attention. Marcus sat still, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. His mind raced. He knew arguing further might disrupt the ceremony and embarrass his son. Yet leaving would send the wrong message that he didn't belong, when in fact he had every right. He thought about his years of service, the missions he had led, and the brothers he had lost in combat. To be told here, in his own country, that he did not belong was a wound deeper than any physical scar. The guards stepped closer, one of them reaching for his arm. The room grew quieter, the music fading into the background as all eyes shifted to the unfolding scene. Marcus slowly rose to his feet, towering over both men. His face was calm, but his presence was commanding. Years of leadership and battlefield authority radiated from him, even though he spoke no words at that moment. The guards hesitated, surprised by the quiet strength in his eyes. For a brief second, no one moved. The silence was heavy, filled with tension. Parents held their breath. The cadets standing at the front shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was happening but unable to turn around. Marcus finally spoke in a low but steady tone. "I have fought for this country. I have bled for it. Today is not about me. Today is about my son. I will not walk out of this hall." His words carried across the row, reaching the ears of families nearby. Some nodded subtly, others pressed their lips together, ashamed of what they were witnessing. The guards, however, seemed unmoved. The shorter one said again, louder this time, "Sir, this is your last warning. Either you step outside, or we'll make sure you're removed." The humiliation was unbearable, but Marcus refused to let his pride break. He thought of David's face when he had said, "Dad, I want you there in the front row. I want to see you when I walk across that stage." Those words gave him strength. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed at the entrance of the hall. Heads turned toward the back as 6 men in crisp Navy uniforms marched in. They were not just ordinary men, they were Navy SEALs, each carrying an air of discipline and authority that made the entire room fall silent. Their steps were in perfect sync, echoing louder with each stride as they moved closer to the front. The 2 guards froze, their hands dropping to their sides. They had no idea what was about to happen. Marcus turned his head slightly, his eyes widening as he recognized the men. They were his brothers in arms, soldiers he had once commanded in dangerous missions overseas. The crowd, sensing the shift in energy, went quiet. The whispers stopped. Every pair of eyes in the hall was now fixed on Marcus and the 6 SEALs moving toward him. The guards stiffened nervously, unsure of what to do. The once proud atmosphere of celebration had transformed into a stage of confrontation, and everyone was waiting to see what would unfold next. And in that tense silence, Marcus knew one thing: the day that had begun with pride and joy was about to take a turn no one in that hall would ever forget. The hall, which only moments ago was filled with cheerful clapping and proud chatter, now sat under an almost suffocating silence. Parents leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between the 2 security guards and Marcus Hill. Children who had been fidgeting moments earlier froze, sensing the seriousness in the air. Even the cadets at the front, though not fully aware of the situation behind them, could feel something shifting in the energy of the room. The ceremony had come to a standstill before it even properly began. Marcus stood tall, his uniform pressed, his medals glinting faintly under the lights. His presence was already powerful, but when the sound of synchronized boots echoed from the back of the hall, the atmosphere changed entirely. 6 Navy SEALs in formal dress uniform marched forward in tight formation, each step measured, each movement sharp. The audience turned in unison to watch them, as though instinctively knowing something extraordinary was about to happen. The 2 guards stiffened. Their confident tone from earlier was suddenly gone, replaced by unease. They exchanged quick glances, their eyes revealing what they refused to admit aloud: doubt. Marcus immediately recognized the men. They weren't strangers to him. Years ago, he had served with them in some of the harshest places in the world. Together, they had faced nights where survival itself was uncertain. They had eaten from the same rations, marched under the same burning sun, and carried the weight of comrades who never returned home. These men were more than friends, they were his brothers. The SEALs continued forward until they reached Marcus. Without hesitation, they stopped, lined up perfectly, and as one, lifted their hands in salute. The crisp sound of their palms hitting their brows rang through the silent hall. The audience gasped. The 2 guards froze in place, realizing they had just humiliated a man who was not only a Marine but a commander respected by some of the toughest soldiers in the world. One of the SEALs, a man with a strong jaw and steady voice, stepped forward. His words were clear, carrying through the hall like a drumbeat. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man is Sergeant Marcus Hill. He is not only a Marine, he is a hero. We stand here today because of him. He led us when everything around us fell apart. He gave us strength when we had none. Without him, none of us would be alive." The weight of those words hit the audience like a wave. Whispers broke out, louder this time, but filled with awe rather than doubt. Mothers dabbed their eyes with tissues, fathers nodded respectfully, and cadets at the front straightened their backs, realizing the man who had been questioned moments ago was someone they could only dream of becoming. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had never sought recognition, never asked for applause. His entire career had been about serving quietly, putting his men first, and returning home with as many of them as possible. But hearing those words, in front of his son's academy, stirred something deep inside him. It wasn't pride in himself, it was relief that his sacrifices had meant something real, something lasting. The guards stepped back, their voices caught in their throats. One opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Their authority, which seemed so heavy moments ago, now crumbled under the weight of truth. The lead SEAL turned to the guards, his voice sharp but controlled. "This man doesn't need an invitation to be here. His name alone is enough." A ripple of applause broke out from the back of the hall. At first, it was scattered, one person clapping here, another there. But within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, cheering and clapping for Marcus Hill. The sound was thunderous, echoing through the high ceilings, drowning out everything else. Marcus stood still, his chest rising and falling, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of respect he had carried in silence reflected back at him. He turned his head slightly and caught sight of his son David, who had just stepped out from the side curtain at the edge of the stage. David froze at the sight before him. His father was standing tall, surrounded by 6 SEALs in salute, while an entire hall clapped and cheered. His heart swelled with pride and emotion he couldn't contain. He had always known his father was strong, but in this moment, he realized just how deeply others respected him. David lifted his chin high, and though he wasn't supposed to enter the stage yet, he couldn't stop himself. He marched across the wooden floor, every step echoing with determination. The applause grew even louder as the audience realized what was happening. When he reached the center of the stage, David stopped, turned toward his father, and raised his hand in a sharp salute. The hall went quiet again, the silence more powerful than the applause had been. Fathers held their sons closer, mothers wiped more tears, and cadets swallowed hard, realizing they were witnessing a moment of history they would never forget. Marcus, overwhelmed by the sight of his son saluting him, raised his hand slowly in return. Father and son locked eyes across the distance, the Marine who had given everything for his country and the young man ready to carry that legacy forward. The seals, still at Marcus's side, lowered their hands in unison. Their eyes shone with pride, not only for their old commander but also for the son who stood ready to walk his own path. Meanwhile, the guards stood frozen, their faces pale. They shuffled awkwardly, realizing the gravity of what they had done. They wanted to disappear, to melt into the walls, but there was no escape from the weight of shame pressing down on them. In the audience, people began to whisper again, but now the whispers were filled with admiration. "That's his father. He's a Marine commander. Those SEALs respect him like that." The story was already spreading like wildfire through the hall. The announcer at the podium, who had been speechless for a while, finally found his voice. Clearing his throat, he spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us continue this ceremony with the honor it deserves. Today is not only a celebration of our cadets but also a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who came before." The applause resumed, softer this time, more respectful, almost like a standing ovation at a sacred moment. Marcus slowly lowered his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He sat back down, the SEALs forming a protective presence near him, making it clear that no one would dare question him again. David, still on stage, held his father's gaze for a few seconds longer before stepping back into line with his classmates. His chest was proud, his eyes moist, but his spirit strong. He knew this day would be remembered not just for his graduation, but for the respect finally shown to his father. And Marcus, sitting in that hall surrounded by honor, knew the truth deep inside. This was more than just his son's graduation, it was a moment that healed wounds he had carried quietly for years. The air inside the graduation hall felt charged, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something far greater than a simple ceremony. The 6 SEALs remained in formation near Marcus, their presence both protective and symbolic. Parents and cadets still whispered about what they had just seen, some still clapping softly even though the hall had returned to order. The 2 guards who had tried to remove Marcus earlier stood awkwardly to the side, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Their earlier confidence had been replaced with silent regret. Marcus sat back down, his uniform catching the light as if to remind the room of who he was. He had wanted this day to be about David, his son, but now the entire ceremony seemed to revolve around him. He did not ask for it, but he could not stop it either. All he could do was breathe deeply and remind himself that his son's moment was still ahead. On the stage, David remained with his classmates, his back straighter than ever. Though the order of events called for patience, the look in his eyes showed he was counting the minutes until he could officially stand beside his father. He had waited his whole life to show the world who raised him, and now the moment was building toward something unforgettable. The announcer cleared his throat at the podium, his voice slightly shaky but trying to regain control of the event. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we will now proceed with the recognition of our graduating class." His tone was formal, but everyone could sense that the earlier drama had changed the meaning of this day. The music began again, the band playing softly as cadets stepped forward one by one to receive their certificates. Families clapped politely for each graduate, but their eyes still returned again and again to Marcus, who sat quietly among the SEALs. His stillness was powerful, he did not need to speak, for the respect in the room now belonged to him. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. "David Hill," the announcer declared, his voice ringing across the hall. "Top of the graduating class, with honors in leadership and service." The audience erupted in applause, louder than it had been for any other cadet. David marched forward, his steps firm, his uniform shining, his chin lifted. Every sound in the room seemed to fall behind the pounding of his own heartbeat. As he accepted his certificate, he turned, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found his father. Marcus stood to his feet, his chest proud, his hand lifting to salute his son. The hall fell silent again, as though the audience knew this was no ordinary exchange. David stood tall on the stage, raised his hand, and returned the salute. Father and son, soldier and cadet, stood locked in a moment that carried more weight than any speech could. The seals snapped back to attention behind Marcus and saluted as well, their sharp movements echoing across the hall. The applause that followed shook the very walls of the building. People rose from their seats, clapping until their hands turned red. Some shouted bravo. Others wiped tears from their eyes. It was no longer just a graduation, it was a ceremony of honor for both father and son. But not everyone was comfortable. The two guards shifted uneasily near the side entrance. They had become the villains in this unplanned drama, and though no one spoke directly to them, they could feel the weight of disapproval from hundreds of eyes. Their earlier arrogance was gone. Now they stood stiff, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Then something unexpected happened. One of the seals stepped forward again, his voice strong and commanding. "We came here today to honor a young man's graduation," he said, gesturing toward David. "But we cannot ignore what nearly happened in this room." This man, he pointed at Marcus, was nearly removed from his rightful place. Let this be a reminder to all of us, never judge someone by appearance or assumption. Respect must always be given where it is due. The crowd answered with more applause, some people nodding their heads firmly, others whispering to their children about the lesson they had just heard. Even the academy officials on stage, though visibly uncomfortable at first, eventually joined in the clapping. Marcus felt humbled. He had never asked for speeches in his name. He preferred quiet recognition, the kind you carried inside rather than on display. Yet as he looked at his son, standing proudly with his certificate in hand, he understood this moment was no longer just about him. It was about teaching everyone in that hall, especially the young cadets, that respect and honor were not given lightly, but they could never be taken away once earned. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had permanently changed. Each cadet that followed David walked across the stage with renewed pride, as though standing taller because of what they had just witnessed. Families clapped louder, cheered harder, and felt part of something much bigger than themselves. Toward the end, the announcer invited the graduates to stand together as a class, raising their hands in oath to serve their country. As David repeated the words with his classmates, his eyes never strayed from his father. Marcus stood as well, hand over his heart, silently mouthing the oath alongside them. He had spoken those same words decades earlier, and now watching his son do the same brought tears he could no longer hold back. When the oath ended, the hall erupted one final time with applause. The graduates threw their caps in the air, their voices cheering in unison. The band played louder, the crowd shouted joyfully, and the hall seemed to glow with pride. But even in that chaos of celebration, attention returned again to Marcus. Parents approached him with outstretched hands, thanking him for his service. Cadets sneaked glances his way, whispering among themselves about the Marine who had commanded SEALs. One young cadet even walked up, nervously saluting him. Marcus returned the salute, patting the boy on the shoulder. "Serve with honor," he said simply, and the boy nodded, his face glowing with pride. Meanwhile, the two guards finally slipped quietly toward the exit, their heads down. They knew they would be remembered not for keeping order, but for nearly stripping a hero of his dignity. Their silence was their only response, their regret heavy. Marcus finally rose from his seat, surrounded by the SEALs who had stood with him. David hurried down from the stage, certificate still in hand. When father and son met in the middle of the aisle, David didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms tightly around his father, holding him as the hall clapped and cheered again. Marcus whispered in his son's ear, his voice thick with emotion. "This day was always about you, son. I'm proud beyond words." David shook his head gently. "No, Dad. Today was about both of us. About who you are, and what you've given. I only hope I can live up to your name." Marcus smiled, pulling back to look into his son's eyes. "You already have." The crowd kept cheering, the sound rising like a wave that seemed endless. And in that moment, Marcus Hill Marine, father, hero, knew that the silence forced on him earlier had been broken forever. Not by anger, not by argument, but by the undeniable respect of those who truly understood what sacrifice meant. And though the day began with humiliation, it ended with honors so powerful that every person in that hall would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. The graduation ceremony had ended, but the energy in the hall did not fade. Families were still standing, shaking hands, embracing, and taking photographs of their proud graduates. The band played a final tune, but most people were too caught up in the moment to notice. For Marcus Hill, the proud Marine who had walked into the hall quietly just hours earlier, the day had transformed into something far greater than he could have imagined. As he stood with his son David in the middle of the aisle, people began to approach him. A mother holding her daughter's hand stopped in front of him. "Sir," she said softly, "thank you for what you've done. My husband served too. Seeing the way those SEALs honored you, it gave me hope." Her eyes watered as she squeezed his hand. Marcus nodded gently, replying with his usual calmness, "We all serve in our own ways, ma'am. Thank you for raising someone who supports that service." One by one, others came forward. Fathers clapped him on the shoulder, mothers offered words of gratitude, cadets saluted nervously, and officials from the academy finally bowed their heads in respect. The same people who had watched in silence earlier when he was being questioned now made sure he knew they stood with him. Marcus accepted their words with humility. He never sought the spotlight, and if it had been up to him, no one would even know his story. But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes the truth must be seen, even if it comes in a way you least expect. David stayed by his side the entire time, his face glowing with pride. He had always known his father was strong, but he had never seen him honored like this before. For years, David had watched his dad live quietly, never bragging about medals or missions, never speaking loudly about what he had endured. Yet today the world had seen what David already knew, that Marcus Hill was a man of integrity and sacrifice, the kind of father and Marine others could only dream of having. As the crowd slowly began to leave the hall, Marcus and David stepped outside into the warm sunlight. The academy grounds were alive with laughter and photographs. Graduates tossed their caps into the air again, families held bouquets of flowers, and the scent of fresh grass mixed with the sound of music still playing faintly from the band. Marcus looked around, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "Take this all in, David," he said quietly. "Today is a day you'll never forget. But remember, it's not just about the awards or the uniform. It's about living with honor, even when no one is watching." David nodded. "I understand, Dad. And I promise, I'll carry your lessons with me." He looked directly into his father's eyes, his voice steady. "When they saluted you, I realized something. I don't just want to serve like you did. I want to live like you do. With the same respect, the same dignity." Marcus smiled, his chest swelling with pride. For all the recognition he had received that day, nothing meant more than hearing those words from his son. The 6 SEALs who had stood with Marcus inside the hall now joined them outside. They greeted David warmly, congratulating him on his achievement, before turning back to Marcus. "We couldn't stay silent, brother," one of them said. "You taught us that honor is not given, it's earned. We weren't going to let anyone take that away from you today." Marcus shook their hands firmly. "I didn't expect this," he admitted, "but I'll never forget it. Thank you, all of you." One of the SEALs grinned. "We owe you our lives. This was nothing compared to what you gave us." They stood together for a while, 7 men bound not just by uniforms, but by shared sacrifice and brotherhood. Families passing by stopped to stare at them, some even snapping quiet photos, knowing they were in the presence of something rare and powerful. Not far away, the 2 guards stood under the shade of a tree, still lingering, unsure of how to leave without drawing attention. Their earlier mistake weighed on them heavier with every passing minute. Finally, one of them gathered the courage to step forward. He walked slowly toward Marcus, his voice low and hesitant. "Sir," he began, "I owe you an apology. I judged you wrongly, and I disrespected you. I was wrong. The other guard joined him, his face equally downcast. We both were, he admitted. Marcus looked at them for a long moment. He could have humiliated them in return. He could have reminded them of their mistake in front of everyone. But instead, he simply nodded. Respect is earned, he said softly, echoing the very words the seal had spoken earlier. Remember this moment, and treat the next person you meet with dignity. That's how we move forward. The guards lowered their heads, ashamed but grateful. They walked away quietly, their lesson learned in the most public way possible. The rest of the day belonged to David and his classmates. Marcus stood proudly with his son for photographs, smiling as David held his certificate high. The academy grounds turned into a celebration of families and futures. Yet for Marcus, there was a calmness that went beyond the noise. He had come to support his son, and instead he had been reminded that respect is not something that can be taken away, no matter how others might try. Later, as the sun dipped low and the crowd thinned, Marcus and David walked together down the long stone path leading out of the academy. The seals had already departed, leaving Marcus with one final salute that burned itself into memory. Father and son walked slowly, the golden light wrapping around them. "Dad," David said softly, breaking the silence, "I'll never forget today. Not just because I graduated, but because I saw who you really are to others. You're not just my father. You're their hero, too." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face his son. "I'm just a man who tried to do his duty," he said gently. "The real victory is you, David. Seeing you stand tall today means everything. You're the future now. Carry it with honor." They hugged again, this time without an audience, just father and son under the fading sunlight. It was quiet, peaceful, and far more powerful than all the applause earlier. That night, when they returned home, Marcus placed the invitation card back into his uniform pocket, where it would stay as a reminder. The world had tried to silence him, but in the end, 6 seals had reminded everyone of the truth. His son had graduated, his name had been honored, and the lesson of respect had been taught to an entire hall of people. The story would be told again and again by those who had been there: how 2 guards questioned a marine, how 6 seals stood up, and how a room full of strangers united in applause. But for Marcus, the greatest memory was simple, the look in his son's eyes, full of pride and love. And that, more than anything else, was the victory of the day.